Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. I'm Penalosa, and I'm the Director of Design at Waterfront Toronto, and I wanted to welcome you all to this public talk on behalf of our Mobility Working Group at Sidewalk Toronto. For those of you who may not know, Sidewalk Toronto is our joint effort with Sidewalk Lab and the local community to co-create a new type of neighborhood on Toronto's waterfront. We see this project as a unique opportunity to address some of the biggest challenges facing cities today. Things like climate change, transportation, and housing affordability, for example. I want to emphasize that these public talks will not focus specifically on the Sidewalk Toronto plans. We have many other opportunities in the coming months for people to provide direct feedback on our work. And you can find a calendar of events at our website, which shows you, and just so you know, our website is located on the program card at the bottom. Instead, we see these talks as a great chance to gather some of the leading expert voices who are not affiliated with the project, but who are tackling some of the same challenges that we're exploring with Sidewalk Toronto. I know we don't have all the answers, but we love hearing about the best new ideas from experts just as much as you do. Tonight, the challenge we'll focus on is how to make city streets more usable, safe, friendly for everyone, whether you're a pedestrian, a cyclist, someone with a disability, a transit rider, or a driver. That is something we believe strongly in at Waterfront Toronto and is work that we've been doing for years. I've been doing it for years personally. One recent example is the Queens Quay redesign, which rebalances the street to give drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians each their fair share, while also maintaining a dedicated streetcar right-of-way for transit. We continue to learn about how the street is being used and have optimized in many different ways and continue to optimize through those learnings. We're excited to have this great group of panelists with us tonight to show some leading examples of complete streets from around the world and to help think about how complete streets can evolve with new transportation needs and services of the future. We hope this conversation leads to an even stronger public dialogue about ways to address this challenge here in Toronto. So thank you again for coming tonight, and I will introduce tonight's moderator, Philip Preville.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Oh, goodness. And we're off to an auspicious start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. Tonight's event is the first in a series of public talks sponsored by Sidewalk Toronto on the challenges facing the future of our city. I think we're all looking forward to a lively discussion. My name is Philip Preville, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Our topic is the future of complete streets. And so, I thought, by way of introduction, that I could make myself useful by providing a brief history of the incomplete streets that we have today. And so I've compiled that here. We'll run through it quickly. In the beginning, there was the grid, and the grid was a mess. The streets were muddy. They were filled with waste that people threw from their windows down into the roadway below. And so about 200 years ago, civic planners and engineers set about improving them by trying to impose some semblance of order upon the street-level chaos. The first thing they did, perhaps you knew, was create raised sidewalks for pedestrians. And the purpose of a raised sidewalk was to keep people's boots out of the waste. And they also encouraged people tossing it out their window to use a little elbow grease to get it into the roadway. Then they paved the streets in asphalt. They did that late in the 19th century, and that made them easier to clean. So this was all about public hygiene and as well as public safety. They then placed a police constable in the middle of every major intersection in the city to direct ever-increasing traffic flows. They had a sign that rotated that said stop on one side and go on the other, and they would rotate it to allow different directions of traffic to proceed. In the first years of the 20th century, Toronto City Council put its foot down and decreed that there would be no more cattle drives on city streets. No doubt to the relief of the traffic constables. In the 1920s, Toronto began to replace traffic constables with traffic lights and traffic signals. But far from simplifying things, the traffic lights themselves beget a whole new wave of dubious improvements. First came the addition of a yellow light, then the flashing green right-of-way. Some people might remember those. They were very popular in Toronto. Then came the left turn arrow, then road paint, white and yellow lines perfectly parallel or perpendicular to direct people or vehicles as they needed to go. Then came the pedestrian signals, the little walking man and his counterpart, the raised right hand. And then came the pedestrian countdown, and on and on. And with each of these technological advancements, surely the city thought, this will do the trick. This last new measure will finally allow pedestrians and motorists and cyclists to share the road safely. And here we are, 200 years into this experiment in safety incrementalism. Right now, in the year 2018, Toronto streets are killing one pedestrian every 5.5 days. According to one of our guests, we were talking earlier backstage, a cyclist is hit by a vehicle in Toronto every 7.5 hours. A pedestrian is hit by a vehicle every 3 hours and 15 minutes. So perhaps it's time to consider the possibility that maybe we've been going about this all wrong, and that what we need is an entirely new approach to designing our streets from the start. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight, and that's where the Complete Streets movement comes in, and that's also where our panelists will take over the discussion because they know the topic much better than I. So let me introduce them to you. Skye Duncan is the director of the Global Designing Cities Initiative at the National Association of City Transportation Officials. She is an urban designer with over 15 years of experience and a former associate professor at Columbia University. She's come all the way from New York to be with us this evening. Please welcome Skye Duncan.
Thanks, Philip.
You're welcome. Gehl Penalosa is an urban planning consultant based here in Toronto. He works internationally. He is the founder of the nonprofit organization known as 880 Cities. And the philosophy of the organization is simple. If you create a great city for an 8-year-old and a great city for an 80-year-old, then you've created a great city for everyone. Please welcome Gehl Penalosa. And our final panelist, Shin-pei Tsay, is the executive director of the Gehl Institute, whose mission is to make public life the driver of civic design, policy, and governance. She is the founder of Planning Corps, which matches urban planners to neighborhood-based initiatives, and she is currently a commissioner with the City of New York Public Design Commission. She's also come all the way from Manhattan to join us. Would you please welcome Shin-pei Tsay. Now, before we get started, a few house rules. Each of our panelists has prepared a presentation for us, and so they will come and give their presentation one at a time on the topic of complete streets. Once they're all done, I'll lead a discussion amongst them here on stage, and as we get to the later moments of the evening, we will open the floor up to questions from all of you. You'll see that there are 2 microphones here, so you can line up or please approach the microphone. Don't be shy. We're eager to have everybody participate this evening. I will signal, if you don't want to end, if you urgently want to ask a question, but we're early in the discussion, don't worry. I will let you know when we're getting ready to start with questions from the floor. Also, I need to let you know, there's no intermission. So we will go from now right through until 9, and I don't expect we'll want or need an intermission because I expect we'll have a very good discussion. So with that, I'll ask Skye to take the floor for her first presentation.
Sure, thanks. I'll grab the clicker over here. How are you guys doing this evening? Good? Awesome. Well, I'm very thrilled to be here in Toronto. It's such an awesome city with so much potential. And I just arrived in last night. I was hoping to do some biking around today. Sadly, the rain wasn't fabulous and a lot of work deadlines came in. But I did get to do a bit of walking around and see some more of the potential. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is shaping safe and sustainable streets, and particularly around the Global Street Design Guide, which is a new resource we've been working on at NACTO's Global Designing Cities Initiative. And it's really about how do we see the potential in transforming our streets in our urban environments and restore the role of the street as the lifeblood of our communities. You may know, some people in this audience, that our streets are our largest continuous network of public space, right? But we've been doing a pretty rotten job in many parts of the world in terms of how we use that space, that real estate. So it's time that we make better, more efficient use of the space in our daily practices in our cities. Now, of course, when we think about streets, right, one of the first things that come to mind is movement, how we move. But we forget often that our streets are also places to play or to learn to ride a bicycle, places to dine or celebrate with our local communities. For some of us, they're places to make money, others to spend it. To spend time with old friends and hopefully meet new ones within our neighborhoods. In our bustling cities, our streets can be a moment to enjoy a touch of nature or to relax. But essentially, our streets are our front doors to our homes and businesses. Yet, we have spent decades designing highway-like conditions in our urban environments, right? We have forgotten that human beings are at the heart of our cities, not big metal boxes. And we've actually forgotten to design space for people. And we've created environments where people have to risk their lives on a daily basis just to go to work or to go to school. We've created streets that are like speedways that invite people to use them like a racing track. And we're our most vulnerable users, and I have a horrifically large collection of photographs like this from around the world. But we put our most vulnerable users in an environment where they have to compete with these large metal boxes moving at large speeds. So we've given our streets our time. Sadly, we've given them our air. We've given them our general well-being. And too often we've given them our lives. Now, around the world, 1.3 million people die every single year on our streets. That's one person every 30 seconds. That's somebody's loved one, somebody's child or friend or family. And this is completely unacceptable. And this is a lot of the work that we're doing with support from the Bloomberg Initiative for Global Road Safety and under the leadership of Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, who was the Commissioner of Transportation in New York under Mike Bloomberg. And some of you here may have heard of NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. We do a lot of things, and I won't go into it, but one thing is we create a lot of design guidance, from bikeway to transit streets to green infrastructure, autonomous vehicles. And it was this body of work that was the impetus to kind of move on from here and take these lessons from a North American context to a global context. And so we created the Global Street Design Guide with experts from over 40 countries and 70 cities, also people from here in Toronto contributing, to really look at how we can shift from this global agenda to local action in a way that provides tools and resources that can inspire leaders, technical enough to inform practitioners, but also to be able to kind of empower communities to know what to demand of their spaces. And yes, it's critical that we get our new street designs right? Of course, that's logical. But if we don't also go and look at our existing assets, our existing streets, and ask what's possible, then we're actually never going to achieve the goals that we're setting out to. And so what we're working at doing is shifting the outdated hierarchy, where the car has been king for way too long and we have forgotten about human beings almost completely, and inverting that to put people on top. Our most vulnerable users, our seniors, our children, our people with disabilities, now are the new lens that we must use to design our streets. Then we prioritize sustainable mobility like transit and cycling. We make sure we can deliver goods and provide city services. And when we have space, we give it to the private vehicles. We were thrilled to have Mike Bloomberg launch this as a free download in May last year, and also with the endorsement campaign. And so we've had mayors and leaders from over 35 cities and 25 organizations now sign on and commit to this new approach of how we design our streets that put place and people at the heart of our designs and demand positive outcomes in terms of health and safety, multimodal access, environmental and economic sustainability, and of course, equity, doing this in a fair and equitable way. Now, when we think about designing for place, of course, we have to think about the built and natural context. But when we're talking about a global publication, we're also trying to make sure that we're working within the social, cultural, and economic conditions of each site. But what we do know is that context changes, right? And any one corridor may need different designs to react and reflect to the context around it. So at one point, it may need to act like a neighborhood main street. A few blocks down, maybe it's a two-way street with dedicated transit. And maybe even the downtown area, the demand on that space is too high, so we actually have to give it all to transit and to pedestrians. And not only in the corridor itself, but at the scale of every block, we talk about what's called curbside management. And so the demands of the different businesses and activities mean that we have to take care to understand how we design each block. Not only in a static way, but also in time, how uses can shift from freight drop-off to parking to maybe parklet style uses. And what's very exciting is now with a lot of the new technologies that are out there, and we're tracking this, we can now input this data, and NACTO just launched a platform called Shared Streets Platform with OTP, where we can now aggregate that data and anonymize it and then use that for city good, right? To give better city services and to make better use of that valuable asset of our streets. So we can track what's happening on each of the curb signs. Now, when we're talking about designing for people, obviously we start with the needs of the pedestrian, thinking about cyclists and transit, people, motorists, but also the freight drivers, and often forgotten as people doing business. And I'm not going to go into these details today. There's a ton in the publication if you want to take a look. But essentially, we're going from this approach where we've been looking at one user and instead looking at a more inclusive approach, where we're understanding the qualitative and quantitative data in a contextual manner. Now, this makes a lot of sense when you start looking at the numbers, right? Because if you actually look at how many people, if you take a 3-meter space and think of how many people you can move in that street, the capacity of the street, right? Cars up here is our least efficient way of using that space. And actually, our sustainable modes are far more effective, right? So many of you have seen diagrams like this, the space taken to move 50 people by foot, by bike, by transit, or by car, or by Uber, or by AV. Right? So as we're growing, as our cities are developing, we have decisions to make about what we fight for and what we design for. Do we want to only take this approach, or do we want to take a multimodal approach? And we can take those very same dimensions and almost overnight, by redesigning it, more than double the capacity of our street. So in the guide, we cover a whole series of different topics, and I'm not talking specifically about complete streets, because some of them aren't complete in terms of having cars included. We include pedestrian-only streets and shared streets. Sometimes it's about tearing down infrastructure that we thought was a great idea and maybe no longer is. So I encourage you to take a look. In each example, it's before and showing after possibilities, and then showing real-life examples and case studies of where people have done this. From small streets to large streets, where capacity has been increased and sustainability increased, like in Argentina and Buenos Aires, or pedestrian priority streets where the cars are removed altogether, many examples of which we've seen out of Copenhagen, one of our kind of poster children of livable streets. So we have to remind ourselves, right? These transformations did not drop out of the sky. We didn't wake up and see them one day. They did not happen by accident. People made decisions to do things differently, to make bold actions, and to invest in safer and more sustainable transportation. And it's happening all over the world, from São Paulo rethinking intersections, or the more complete streets in San Francisco, traffic calming strategies in Mexico City, and small plazas in Moscow rethinking their streets, to pop-up parklets in Glasgow and Scotland, and one of my favorites in the last few months of pedestrian-only streets in Santiago in Chile, painting this and bringing communities together in these great new spaces. Even in Tirana in Albania, they're taking a new approach, right? This is how they're starting the design of their cities and their new citizens. Paris is rethinking its waterfronts along the Seine and giving it back to the people. New Zealand, where I'm from, which is maybe why I sound a bit funny, but I'm part of the Commonwealth, we took off-ramps to highways and painted them hot pink and gave them back to the cyclists as a connection to get people through the city. And I love this because in the same year, in 2016, both Auckland and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia both put in their first protected bike lane, right? Totally different language, context, climate, culture, everything. But we're in this together. We're all grappling with how to do this and how to do a better job. So we have to look around and borrow and steal and adapt ideas from each other. And it's great to see the start of this here, from the King Street pilot to the Bloor Street bike lane, which I hear is now going to be permanent. Congratulations. But that's just the beginning, right? That whole network has to be expanded. And of course, the beginning of what we've seen, great moves on the waterfront, that again needs to be scaled up to put Toronto at the forefront of the best global streets around the world. We need you guys in this room, right? We need your bold visions, your technical support, your advocacy, and your local action to get us there. We know it can be hard, right? It can be tiring, and these changes can take a really long time. We also know it can be scary, right? It's a little freaky when we ask to change. And even when we want to change, we don't really want to change, right? So we have to kind of step back and think about what kind of future we want for our future generations. We find at GDCI, at NACTO, a very simple recipe, often of paint and plants. We can go and transform spaces overnight, from car parks in Bogota to intersections in Mumbai, to taking speeding buses and look at these pedestrians with nowhere to go in São Paulo, transforming it overnight in a matter of 5 hours to show results that people actually felt safer in the after conditions on the sidewalk. And they felt safer in the crosswalks, walking with their children. And the final one I want to show is a project from Fortaleza, north of Brazil, where this space here, you could barely call it a street, right? It's at the heart of this community. So we worked with the city and a number of other partners to transform the space in a matter of 72 hours. We took from 21% to 73% of space for pedestrians. Spaces that were dangerous to cross, hot, nowhere to sit down, nothing to do, and transform those into the community. We were able to give people places to sit and rest. Sorry, there's a slight delay on here. We saw entire families out there teaching their kids how to use the bikes. And then we asked people, do you like it? Do you like the before or do you like the after? Right? And this 15-day project then got support to become permanent. 94% of the people liked it. Almost 100% of the people wanted pedestrians to be prioritized. This lady actually started a petition and took it to the mayor and said, we don't want this just for 15 days. We want this permanently. Because we'd shown them what's possible. We'd given someone a chance to see their streets in a new light. The kids here, the paint was not even dry. You can see the cones here. And they were so desperate to go out and play. They had never seen their streets. And the expression on this child's face says so much, right? And what happened, I want to show you this very short, it's an 8-second video, but this child here, we said to him, okay, right now, he was so excited. He was running here back and forth, right? And we said, cool, yeah, you're having fun. That's great. We said, but you know what? Tomorrow, you're going to be able to run from here to like there and back. And this was his reaction. Let me see if I can, or maybe they can play it back here for me. You don't need the audio. It's like, oh my God, look at this, right? So it's these kinds of reminders. We know it's hard, it's a big fight. But we hope that these resources can provide a tool to help cities to reimagine and reinvent and design safer streets that put people first. And our challenge to you guys here is to endorse it, to ask for it, to demand it, design it. If you guys have the money, then fund it. But just do it. Just fight for streets that put people first. So you can be the safe street superheroes of Toronto. And together, slowly but surely, we can change streets to change the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Skye. I got to ask you, the painting that you did on city streets,
Yeah.
was that like guerrilla stuff under cover of night?
We do, yeah. We often work through the night. It's pretty exhausting. I've got a whole set outfit that's covered in paint. But we do a guerrilla style, but with
permits,
yes, with permission.
Ah, okay.
We actually go and train the city staff to come out there and do it with us and show them how to do this so that they can do it themselves.
It's wonderful. It's delightful.
Yeah, it's the best part of the job, right?
Gehl, please take the floor. Gehl Penalosa.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be talking about complete streets, or even more than complete is to be talking about streets. Because if we look at a city from the air, about 30–35% of our city are streets. And they are public space. They belong to all of us. So what are we going to do with that space? And it's so nice to be talking about it here at the waterfront. I've been in Toronto for about 19 years, and I think that since in the last 20 years, probably the most exciting and successful project is Waterfront Toronto. You know, sometimes we forget that just a few years ago, in front of this theater, it was 4 lanes of cars. And now it's a huge boulevard for walking, for cycling, with trees and benches, and only 2 lanes for cars. And the world didn't end. And it's exciting. And sometimes, one of the things I don't like about complete streets is that people say, okay, you know, can people walk? Can people bike? Can people take public transit? Can car? Okay, it's done. No, it's not. I wish it was that simple, but unfortunately, it's not. Some streets actually might be complete and you don't have people walking or cycling. Others might also be complete and you don't have cars or public transit. So it's not really that concept of complete. Some people are talking about shared streets. And sometimes it even becomes fashionable. People say, oh, wow, let's take away all of the signs. Take away the signs and the lights and everything. And it's going to be so cool because now people are going to be really, really careful. Because now people are going to have to negotiate. What? That might be a tiny street in the middle of some city that might... But let's think about it. Do you want this guy to be negotiating? Or do you want this girl? If she was your daughter, would you want her to be negotiating? When we talk about sharing spaces, we always need to think of the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable has to be the guideline. It's not, when we talk about sharing, it's not having everybody, the cars at their own speed, and the cyclists at their speed, and the walkers at their speed. No. Who's the most vulnerable? The child, the older adult, and so on. So let's think about those issues. We're also talking about democracy on the streets. You know, our Constitution says that all people are equal. But sometimes I get on a streetcar with 80 people, and we go like a turtle behind cars with 1 person. If democracy works, 80 people inside a streetcar should have at least the right of space of 80 cars with 1 person on them. I mean, this is something that could be really simple, talking about pilot projects. Let's do a pilot for 100 days on any, on Dundas, on College, on any. For 100 days, let's say, okay, at least during the peak hours, from 7 to 9, and then from 4 to 7, let's have the streetcars only for streetcars, and then the cars on the side. So it's about democracy. It's also about flexibility. We need to understand that the space belongs to all of us. It's public, so we can have different uses according to the time of the day of the week of the year. So it's part of that flexibility. It's also exciting. And now this is moving.
If you point it that way.
Flexibility. So when we evaluate streets, we should evaluate streets is about how do we treat the most vulnerable people. And the most vulnerable people in our cities are the children, the older adults, the poor. So when we also talk about walking, walking is a lot more than walking. Walking is not just having the sidewalk. It's too often people say, oh, how wide should the sidewalk be? Well, that's not a question for engineers. Maybe in 2 meters, people fit. But if we have 4 meters, maybe people make friends. And if we have 12, people go have parties. So maybe we should have sidewalks for people to have parties. We should also have trees. And at the street level, we should have retail. And we should have windows. And so many things happen when we are walking, like the speed of the cars. People walk differently when the cars are going by at 30 kilometers an hour than when the cars going at 60 or 80. So when we are using bicycles or transit or cars, usually we're going from point A to point B. But when we are walking, we are really doing so many other things. That's why the sidewalks are so important. I think the most important public space in any city are the sidewalks. The sidewalks is that is where we meet each other as equals. We make boyfriends and we meet girlfriends and we get to know the people in the stores and the people selling fruits and vegetables and coffee. And it's actually the sidewalks in many ways shouldn't be part of the transportation department because it's not about moving people. Sidewalks maybe should be part of Parks and Rec because we walk and we sit and we socialize and we watch people go by. You know, one of the things that people like the most, we're social animals. We like people. So we enjoy, one of the biggest ways of being joyful is we enjoy meeting other people or just watching other people. Just the presence of each other makes us happier. And of course, we also ride bicycles and we use public transit. So on a complete street is not just putting some sharrows and saying, okay, you know, bike, yes, check. No, sharrows doesn't. You know, when we have 30K or less, we can mix cars and cyclists. Anytime that we go above 30K, we need to have protected bikeways. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's not just even just painting a line. Enhance that painting line with bollards. And instead of doing just one bikeway, how can we be so happy that we did 2 kilometers on Blur? That's nothing. Nothing. It's insignificant. We need a grid. We need connectivity. Nothing as important as connectivity. I mean, if you don't bike because you are afraid, and now you got 2 kilometers, 20% of your ride is safe, but the other 80% is not. Are you going to bike? We need minimum grids in the city. Same thing with public transit. It's not about doing a $4 billion one-stop subway. And then what are you going to do? Instead of that is how to develop a network, even in that community. So both in cycling and public transit, we need that connectivity. On the bikeways, I'm a founder of 880 Cities. 880 Cities is a simple concept. What if everything that we did in our cities had to be great? For an 8-year-old and for an 80-year-old, the sidewalk, the crosswalk. I mean, if you do a bikeway, and you're not going to allow the children, the 8-year-olds or the 80-year-olds, don't even call it a bikeway. Call it nothing. It's just non-existent. Bikeways is not about doing something for the 20 to 50-year-old men in spandex. It's for everybody. So it's one of the things that the other thing about streets, we need to keep the public of the public space. The streets are public space. They belong to all of us. I mean, would you allow someone to go into your house and start filming what your children do, what your spouse is doing, and maybe putting a hot dog stand in the middle of your house and taking photos and things? No, they would need to have permission or pay you something to do that, right? Well, why is it that we think that people can do it in the public space and don't pay anybody or don't need a permit from anybody? No, we need in the public space. Sometimes people say, oh, the public space doesn't belong to anybody. No, it's just the opposite. The public space belongs to everybody. It's ours. So it's much more valuable and much more critical than the private. It's almost sacred. So anybody that is using, where they're doing shoe shining or putting security cameras or taking counting or doing whatever, all of that information has to be public. At least we are the owners of that. Everybody. So we need to be very, very, very careful on whatever we do in the public space. And we need to enhance and make sure that everyone that is using the public space is making it nicer for everybody. And part of keeping the public space public is we need to be better at managing the public space. Maybe it's good to have private sector doing things. It could be great. Maybe we should do more steering and less rowing. But if the public sector is going to be doing the steering, we need to be a lot smarter. So, okay, we can delegate cutting the grass or picking up the garbage. We can even delegate doing buildings or doing whole communities, as long as the decision, the final decision, has to be public. But then the public needs to be ready for this. The other day, I read an interview with the mayor about the new project on Sidewalk Labs, and he's the biggest cheerleader. However, when they said, have you read the contract? No. How can we have, so that's part of, when we're going to do the steering and not the rowing, we got to be smarter. We need our mayor to read the contract. By the way, the executive summary is only 24 pages. It's not 5,000. So all of us, so Waterfront Toronto is public. So we really need the public. And we need to understand the private sector, at the end of the day, anybody that is in the private sector, they report to a board of directors, and they're to make money. But people that work in the public sector, they work for all of us. The well-being, so that's really critical. Also, we need to have technology for people, not people for technology. So technology is magnificent. I've seen some traffic lights now in Munich that they have a sensor. And if the light goes red, but there is a pedestrian that is on the crosswalk, it will not give the green light to the cars to start as long as there is a person on the crosswalk. That's part of using technology. There are so many fascinating ways that we could use technology. As long as we have clear that we're going to have, is not about technology for people and not people for technology. And it could be magnificent. And I think we could really make our lives a lot healthier and happier in so many ways. We also got to have equity. A complete street is not something just for the rich or just for the poor. No, we need to integrate. We need not to segregate. We cannot have 80-story buildings, even if the architect is so famous. And then where's the public space? Oh, it's going to be on the 4th floor. No, on the 4th floor is not a public space. That's nice if you do a terrace, but the public space has to look and feel public so that everyone is going to use it. So walking, cycling, public transit, or cars clearly is not done. It's a lot more than that. So in many ways, we need to develop an urgency, even more of an urgency when we're in Toronto. You know, the greater Toronto area, in the next 25 years, we're going to go by 50%. 50. Imagine you had a magic wand, and you could redo half of Toronto, even the best half. We would do it even better. That's the magnificent opportunity. But the reality is that most of what we have done in the greater Toronto in the last 25 years is really mediocre. Just think about it. It's not really sustainable financially, environmentally, in any way. So what are we going to do in the next 25? So we really need to change. And I know that change is hard. That's why many times the politicians are afraid, oh no, it's change, because doing more of the same is easier. But this is not a time to do what is easy. You know, this is change. This is how change happens. This is magnificent. These kids, these high school kids, we got to learn from them. And, you know, sometimes people say, oh, you know, in Copenhagen, everybody bikes. It's because those Danish, those Vikings are so different. Not really. You know, the car was taken over in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in all over Europe, until the energy crisis in the 70s. So when they had the energy crisis, they had to bike and walk. And all of a sudden they say, oh, you know, maybe this could be nice. Maybe we don't need the car. Maybe we're going to save a lot of money. Maybe we're going to have money for retirement. But since they didn't have infrastructure, a lot of people were being killed in Amsterdam. And the newspapers were showing how many children were being killed. And the same thing was happening in Copenhagen. And people were, every time that there was any pedestrians or cyclists killed, people would go in front of City Hall, dying. And then Copenhagen, that's when they were seeing that the politicians, they decided to do cycle tracks. They was the first cycle track in Copenhagen in 1982. And then people started to bike and went from less than 10% to now they are at 41%. Toronto's at 2%. This is at 41%. And now they're saying, well, we want to go to 50%. And now they're really happy. So I want to end by saying we need to change. It's very clear. But we need also a sense of urgency because we're going to increase by 50%. There is no other urban area in the developed world that is growing as fast as the Canadian urban area. So 3 recommendations for change. First, change is not unanimous. Change is not. Sometimes politicians say, oh, but there is some concern. There will always be concern. If you want it to be unanimous, you have to water it down so much that it's not going to be changed any longer. Second, the general interest must prevail over the particular. So it's not because one restaurant owner comes out and gives us the finger that we're going to change. That's the particular interest. No, what is the general interest? The general interest must prevail. And third, when you say no to something, you're also saying yes to something else. So when you say, oh, we're not going to do this park, or we're not going to do this bike, okay, that's fine. But then you're also saying, we're going to have more sprawl, and we're going to have more obesity, and we're going to have more mental health issues, and so on. So I just want to end by saying, what if everything that we did as we grow, the other 50%, everything, we had as an indicator that the sidewalk and the crosswalk, that we don't have a complete street unless everything that is happening on the street, everything. And not only 8-year-olds, even children under 5. We work with Urban 95. What is Urban 95? What does a city look like at 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old? We're going to double the population over 65. We're going to quadruple the population over 80. So if our cities, if our streets that are 30%, 35% of our city, if they don't work for the children and the older adults and the handicapped, then they don't work. So let's make sure that we have streets that work for everybody so that we will have a vibrant city and healthy communities where everyone can be happier. Thank you.
Thank you, Gehl.
It only clicks from the corner.
Shin-pei, please.
Great, thanks. I really enjoyed all those presentations. Thank you, and also for the background on how we even got to this stage of needing to rethink our streets and really think about the future of our streets. So I wanted to share a snapshot of what we think of as human scale streets. And we think that's the future of our streets at Gehl Institute. So our mission is to transform, is to make public life a driver for design, policy, and governance. And we were founded by the Gehl practice. It's a design practice that we share a vision with Cities for People. Our work is about creating the conditions for this change to happen. So rather than working on a project-by-project basis, we are thinking about the upstream. What can we do to set the room, to create the rules, to make that change possible for more and more places, more and more people, for people like you. And what we're really talking about at the human scale is those everyday kinds of spaces. And as the previous presenters have talked about, a majority of those everyday kinds of spaces take place on our streets. And we all know how much bad places or poorly designed spaces, places that don't center people in them, can really have a negative impact, can lead to social isolation, lack of cohesion, and really actually there's been a study recently that it can have the same effect as if you were smoking your entire life, to live in places that really had such a negative health impact. So the issue is to put people at the center, and it doesn't matter where you are, what culture you come from, there is aspect of being human that's a good place to start. So people are the starting place, and you think about building from how you as a person experience place. In this kind of work, we are thinking a lot about inclusion, including people of all different kinds and abilities, of different cultures, but we're thinking about the way that they take in the experience. And we also think about how our public spaces are surrounded by all sorts of policy and all sorts of systems that define those spaces. So this is a kind of regular everyday street in Zurich, nothing too exciting, but it's surrounded by all these different design elements that are defined by policy systems that say this is the way that you can shape your built environment and shape the street. And we all know that as a person, we walk down the street and we don't think about walking in the transit lane and then moving over to the park lane and then here's the waterfront area. We think of it as all of our, it's an experience all in one. And so that's something that we think about in terms of how to make that change possible. It happens at the block level, happens at the individual level, and it happens at the regional level. And I think what we really want to focus on is that block level, which both Skye and Gehl really spoke to so well. How are you experiencing, creating those kinds of experiences for everyone to enjoy the street? And global best practices will be needed, so we're thinking about making this happen more and more quickly around the world and to apply that thinking all over the place. So what does it mean to take human scale thinking and translate it to the street? One project that has had a lot of notoriety because it happened actually 10 years ago, if you can believe it, is a project that the Gehl practice did in New York City. They looked at 5 different sites and tried to really collect data about how people were using the street. It was all over New York City. They tried to pick different kinds of places where there was a lot of pedestrian volume, but a huge amount of conflict, and also places that the agencies had sort of given up on, like, we're never going to move that curb, we're never going to get the funding, it's never going to happen. And the data really allowed them to see the place with fresh eyes, the data of just really trying to center the perspective on how people were using the space, revealed all sorts of interesting insights that then lead to building a political case for making that change. So in this case, this is Times Square in New York City. They discovered that 89% of the road space was being used for cars, but actually 11% was actually set aside for people, but the reality of the situation is the use of the space was the exact opposite. Nearly 90% of the people moving through that space were on foot. And that led the New York City DOT to be able to create a case for making some of the tactical changes that Skye talked about that led to the pedestrianization, that then a few years later led to the capital funding. And it was step-by-step, incrementally, collecting the data, centering people in that data, using that information to keep moving forward. It takes a long time sometimes. In that case, it didn't take that long in the world of transportation engineering. But we were really, really interested in how do you accelerate this process. And this is something that's been something that's fascinated me in terms of how change happens. I did some research looking over the last 10 years at cities that really were able to apply transportation innovation in a really accelerated way. What was behind that acceleration? How come they were able to do this so much more quickly than, let's say, the previous 40 years since the Interstate Highway Act? And what we found, actually, is that a lot of times the ideas came from outside of government, but there was pressure on the city agencies to then make that change. And if the city agency could codify it somehow in the design guide, and new standards, new norms, new practices, and they had the mandate and the backing from city leadership, if there was that kind of alignment, then you would get that very fast acceleration of change happening in a place. So there's lots of different kinds of things you can do. I'm sure that many of you are involved in many different aspects. But one thing I wanted to share here that we think is moving in the future direction is some of these standards that really help cities then share best practices, do better analysis. So this new standard that we're working on is the Public Life Data Protocol. And basically, it's that data that I was talking about earlier that helped build that political case to make that change. So across the world, actually, more and more places are collecting this data. They're collecting data about how many people are moving down the street, what are they doing in place, are they sitting, are they leaning, are they with others, are they listening to music, are they eating? It gets pretty granular at that block level, but it's really useful data because it helps you understand where you should put your money and how you should best prioritize uses. Maybe, there's been many cases where you might think that a block, a lot is being used by people who are, indigent, or they're just, they're drinking in the empty lot. But often we found that when we do this kind of data analysis, that isn't the case, that there are usually a lot of diverse uses, and you would be surprised at how much people really rely on public spaces and that gives you an opportunity to think about your street differently. So what's great about this is a lot of people are collecting this data, but they're all collecting it really differently, and it's really hard to compare this data across different spaces. So what we're doing is creating a common language to organize this data so that you can actually compare. You can say, in this city, across these plazas, this is the kind of activity that's taking place, and then you can even compare across different cities. And that creates the condition for more human-scale streets wherever you are, if you can engage everyone in making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Shin-pei.
Welcome.
That was wonderful. The image that struck me was the one early in your presentation where you circled all of the different rules and signage and regulations and prohibitions, and it seems to me that city streets have really become almost littered with these kinds of restrictions on use, right? I mean, and parking restrictions being the classic example of you can only park on this side of the street from 1:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon every second Tuesday, and sort of things like that. But for clarity for myself, but also for the audience, that complete streets and more livable streets is in some measure about getting rid of some of those. Is that?
On the no, you cannot side of things, for sure. And I think that slide really what it spoke to was how many different aspects of city management really defined the experience of a street. So it wasn't so much about the kinds of, it was about the regulations in terms of what governs the shape.
Right.
But it isn't necessarily about the no's, but definitely you want to get rid of the, everyone's been to a park where it's like a litany of do not do this, do not do that, and that really is a turnoff in terms of people being able to enjoy a space. But it's important, I think, when you're pursuing change to understand that it's not just a single agency. It might be a multitude of different actors in a city that can affect that change.
Right. Skye, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I would add this actually my old hat. I used to work for the planning department in New York City and work on a lot of the stuff. So yes, you want to take out some of the no things. But actually what's fascinating is if you ask, and I'm trained as an architect originally, if you ask architects or planners or policymakers if they design streets, they'll say, no, I don't design streets, I design buildings. But if you actually look at the street like a room and break down all the different planes, then architects, policymakers, regulations around the transparency of windows and the spacing of entrances and signs and awnings, all of those things, an architect and the policymakers and the planners actually design around 50% of our streets, right? Because we experience them as human beings in 3 dimensions, not in 2 dimensions. In a plan and in a drawing, it looks like the right-of-way is all part of the Department of Transportation. But you tilt that and think spatially, and actually the planning department's doing this, and the local architect's doing that, and the developer's doing the top of that building, and collectively, actually the DOT is only doing a portion of that whole space.
Right.
But also, I think it's not about getting rid of those guidelines. It's about making guidelines that make sense. It's guidelines for people. Let me give you an example. 2 weeks ago, the Toronto Foundation came out with a report of vital signs. And it showed that in the neighborhoods where the wealthy people live in Toronto, the tree coverage, the tree canopy is around 85%. In the low-income areas, it's between 6 and 10%. We should have guidelines. The same way that we have for street and speed is how many trees are we going to have? The minimum guidelines for street trees, the minimum guidelines for benches. We know we are getting older, and we're going to quadruple the population over 80 and double the population over 65. Older adults will not walk if there are not benches every block or every other block. So it's about how to do that. It's not about how to do the streets and have guidelines to move cars. That's what we've been doing in the last 80 years. In the last 80 years, we've been building cities more thinking on car mobility than on people's happiness. So when people say, oh, it's about balance, what do you mean balance? We are totally unbalanced after 80 years of just thinking cars, cars, cars. So we do need to reframe the guidelines and put some guidelines around people.
Now, you talked about it early in your presentation, Gehl, about the situation where you don't want an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old having to negotiate their way across the street in the absence of guidelines. But there are some cities, aren't there, that experimented with that, with let's do away with all the signage and open it up and see what happens. And I'm wondering, what happened?
There's different outcomes on different projects. I think in some cases, I think the data is still early days. So they're looking at, when they first do it, I think to Gehl's point, like everyone's like a little slower in figuring it out. But you go back to the most vulnerable users. I haven't seen the data that says, that's asked those people, how do they feel if you actually just have to suddenly be confident and walk out in the street in front of a car, right? That's very easy for an able-bodied person to do, but pretty scary for a young child or somebody else. So. It's a bit like being in Mumbai. That's the only way for anyone to cross the street. You have to walk out and cross your fingers and with one hand and hope you're not dying and put your hand out to stop the vehicles in another. But there are successful examples also of shared streets, and not because I'm from New Zealand, but Auckland has actually done a network of really interesting shared street models. But I wouldn't say there's nothing in the space. They've got trees and benches and other elements. It's one continuous surface, so vehicles can access it. But the queen or king of the space is the pedestrians. The cars are invited, and their behavior is shaped through the placement of different elements and planting and so forth.
They are not sure that everybody's at their own terms. No, they may say, okay, which is the most vulnerable? The pedestrian. So let's put everybody at the pedestrian level. So for example, but not major streets. So you're not going to do that on Dundas or on Yonge or on Bloor or anything like that. But for example, we could do it in small streets like John Street in Toronto. John Street, where all the restaurants and theaters and things, you could do it. And there's a really good project coming by, but then you really lower the speed. There's going to be lots of bumps, and the street is going to be, a road diet is going to be narrower. So instead of 2 lanes, there's going to be only 1. So if you make the small stretch and you make totally the look and the feel for pedestrians, then you invite cyclists on the pedestrian terms, you might invite cars on the pedestrian terms, and then it might work. But these are isolated, but it's not something citywide where the cars are going by at 80 or 100 kilometers an hour.
Okay. Talking about the elderly, now I don't live in the city of Toronto anymore. For the last 7 years or so, I've been living in Peterborough, which is 90 minutes northeast of the city. And it's a smaller city. And when I first moved I was living right in downtown Toronto, one of the first things I noticed was, first of all, it wasn't as culturally diverse, but the type of diversity that I noticed in Peterborough that I didn't see as much of in Toronto was more elderly and more people with disabilities and families with people with disabilities. So in Peterborough, the city's pace is slower, and it struck me that the slower city pace made sense to those kinds of vulnerable populations, and I understand Peterborough is a magnet for the elderly. But we still need to make room for more and more elderly here in Toronto, and can we slow the pace of the city down?
I don't think you need to slow the pace of the city necessarily to accommodate elderly or people who have more needs. I actually lived in a neighborhood in Brooklyn where there were a higher proportion of senior citizens, and I thought it was great. And the reason it worked that way was that there were a lot of apartment buildings that had elevators. You could walk within 3 blocks to a drugstore or a grocery store. There was a public library within walking distance. So this compactness actually is what enables the ability to accommodate people with a diversity of needs, I think. And I think that works the same for new parents with, they have a radius of maybe a couple of blocks when they have a child.
Absolutely.
And then I think the elderly, same thing. So that actually really enables you to shoehorn in all the services you need and still accommodate a growing population.
And particularly when elderly can't drive anymore,
yeah, that's right.
And so then your whole mobility and your access and your radius shrinks, right?
Yes,
in
it
the
does.
kind of suburban sprawl.
Yes, it does.
So,
But depending on where you are, still crossing the street can be an act of courage.
Yeah, but the thing is this, we have as many older people in Toronto as in Peterborough, proportionally.
Okay.
The thing is, it's funny because I've worked in more than 300 different cities in all continents of all sizes. And almost in everyone, I've met with half of them work directly with the mayors. Everyone, people say, oh, Gehl, we have a problem. Yeah, what is the problem? Oh, we're getting too many old people. I said, first, it's not a problem. Second, it's not you, it's everybody. If we had 200 years ago, we didn't have any country in the world, any, that had a life expectancy above 45. None. Today, we don't have any that has a life expectancy below 45. In Canada, we have doubled the life expectancy in the last 120 years. So we are getting, the difference is that when the cities are nicer to walk or to bike, then you see a lot more people, a lot more older adults, a lot more children, a lot more people handicapped. People go to Portland, and all of a sudden people go to Portland and say, oh my God, all the handicapped people of the US are in Portland. No, that's not it. Most of the hippies of the US are in Portland, but no, the reality is that Portland is very safe for walking. So people come out. Yes. In the cities that are not safe, they stay inside, they stay indoors. So this is something, and it's critical because, for example, you mentioned about the driving. The older adults, the two biggest issues of older adults are mobility and isolation. So being able to get to places, people want to age in place. In Peterborough and in Toronto, people want to age in place, people want to continue visiting their friends and the shops and so on. Isolation is a huge problem. The UK just created 2 months ago the Ministry of Loneliness, the Ministry of at the same level as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Ministry of Health or Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Loneliness. So we need, and that's part of the sidewalks also, when I was saying that sidewalks is not just to move people from A to B. That's why we also need to be able to sit and socialize and organize activities and so on. So it's not that they don't exist in the other places. It's that when it's not friendly to children and older adults and so on, or handicapped people, the handicapped people tend to stay inside.
Okay. Skye, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I agree completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is Toronto doing what it needs to do to accommodate those communities? We've talked about, yeah, it's possible.
Not really. The reality is that we are talking, but we're not doing. We signed Vision Zero. We said, oh, we're gonna do Vision Zero. And then we said, Vision Zero, in 10 years, we're gonna reduce deaths by 20%. So then that means that if you had seen the families that have lost a family member, you're going to tell them 10 families. In years from now, 8 of them will still be dead. What? So within 24 hours, it went from 20%, now it's 100%, but we didn't increase the money. So that's just playing games. That's just playing politics. Instead of Vision Zero, we're having zero vision on this. We really need to work. These are not technical issues. These are not financial. This is totally doable all over the city. Let me give an example. The other day, the mayor and some of the staff went to a school and said they improved the walkability to the school and with crosswalks and so on. And they said, we are not going to stop until we do all schools. Starting in 2018, we're going to do 20 schools per year. And everybody said, if you do 20 schools per year, it's going to take you 51 years to do the schools of Toronto. It's going to take you, if you just do the elementary schools, it's going to take us 31 years. Come on, we need to stop playing politics, political games, and let's focus. We are so wealthy, we could easily do all of the schools in one term. So, but we need to make this a priority. That's doing 20 schools per year is not it. Today, the city council was discussing if we will lower the speed and in Yonge, near North York, and all of a sudden, there is a study, 2-year-old study, all of the public engagement, all the committees, all the studies. It's very hard to get urbanists on board. Almost all of the urbanists, unanimous. All of the newspapers, unanimous that they should go from 6 lanes to 4, widen the sidewalk. The mayor and more than half of council, they were not. So what do they do to play games with this? They say, oh, let's defer. We need more information. What, after 2 years? So in other words, no, I think we're talking, but we're not doing. And we really need to move from talking to doing. We need, when you said a pedestrian is hit in Toronto. Report it to the police. A pedestrian is hit by a car every 3 hours and a half. A cyclist every 7 hours and 15 minutes. That's not civilized.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of become complacent, I think, on this issue, right? Like, when people, with the road safety in people's lives, it's kind of like, oh man, bummer, like wrong place, wrong time, you know? And it's just seen as something that's acceptable, right? You look at like the Malaysian Airlines plane crash goes down, right? And whatever, 300 plus people die. It's that's on the front page of every newspaper around the world for weeks and weeks and weeks and months, right? But if that same number of people are dying tenfold in a city, it's kind of like, oh, well, you know. It's ridiculous. We've kind of lost perspective of the value of human life. And I think, to Gehl's point, like, you know, we get great programs out there, and yes, you know, we can say we're doing 20 of this or 100 of those, and it's important to set political goals, but we can't get lost in that in terms of just getting action done, right? And a lot of these things, we know exactly what to do. The strategies, it's not rocket science. They're very straightforward. Strategies can be applied on every single street across the city, and overnight we could start saving lives immediately.
Let's talk about those in a minute. Shin-pei.
Well, I was just going to add, I think this is a really common lament, right, of a lot of cities where you just feel like, you know, you're stagnating. You know, Portland had their kind of flurry, their burst of innovation in the 70s, and when I was visiting out there, they felt like they were conservative and not taking risks, et cetera, and I think it is really worth thinking about what is a catalytic reason or a framing reason to create that sense of urgency, as Gehl was talking about. It actually is not static. It is easily changed, and it can change from term to term or people to people. Your ability to organize, I think, is hugely important. And so I always think that there's the ability to break through the stagnation, and really encourage people to think about that.
And also, Toronto's a good city. I mean, with the kind of work that I do, I could live anywhere. Why do I live in Toronto? Because I love it. It's a very good city. If we wanted to do a list of cities that are worse than Toronto, in 5 minutes we could have 1,000 cities. But if we benchmark ourselves with cities that are worse than us, eventually we're going to look like those. No, Toronto, with all the resources that we have, the universities, the private and public sector, the NGOs, we should say, okay, which are the best cities of similar size and similar income level for walking? Which are the best in cycling? Which are the best one in parks, in tree canopies, in quality of air, in level of noise, in mental health, in physical health, and so on? We need to benchmark with the best in the world. So we cannot become complacent just because the economy says, oh, it's one of the most livable. Then we develop a myth of excellence, and all of a sudden we become reluctant. We put the brakes on everything.
It seems as though sometimes Toronto's best motivator for change and innovation is embarrassment. Children, our guests from New York will be very interested to learn that up until very recently, children in Toronto were prohibited from playing ball hockey on city streets in the greatest hockey city in the world. Wow. So in the glass half full department, at least that has changed. Skye, you talked about, like, there are simple strategies that people can use. So, because let's talk about processes and strategies for a minute, because we do have 1.5 kilometers of complete street right outside the door here on Queens Quay. And it's beautiful. It's also controversial. And it took 10 years to build. So the pace of change can be slow if you're working at the scale of large institutions. Yeah. But I think you've got some ideas about what people can do at the neighborhood level.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, some of the strategies, many of the images I was showing are very quick things you can literally go out and do overnight, right? And they're very simple, right? Things like shortening crossing distances and redistributing space and trialing things out and seeing if it works, putting curb extensions, making better crossings, something that doesn't even cost a lot of money, looking at the signal timing so that your elderly people in the dense cities can get from one side of the street to the other very quickly, right? Right. And I think what we have to do is look at the menu of options that we have and then understand who can play which role in terms of getting the projects on the ground, right? Ideally, we have an innovative mayor in every city and, like, we get things done and that's great, right? But reality is it's not true. And in many cases, we can't rely on the top level political leadership to get projects done. So we need to look at the advocacy community, right, which plays a huge role, particularly, you know, New York, and Shin-pei was part of this team, the advocacy around road safety and dropping the speed limits and rethinking the safety around schools. That primary push came from the advocacy community, right? And the more we can help practitioners to change where they're drawing the line so that the projects that go to the city to start with are more innovative and push the boundaries, as well as the city officials are asking the consultants to do more innovative projects, and the communities and the parents of the schools are demanding the change in their environment. So we have to you have to look at all the different stakeholders, and we can't keep passing the ball and blame, well, it's their job, it's their job. We all have an action that we can take, and we just have to understand where do we sit.
What I like so much about the tools that Skye uses actually is that she really creates an experience, like you saw the joy on that little boy's face, and so this experiential aspect of these tactical projects are something that when the city is not trying them out, we always want the city to kind of pick up that practice and keep on pushing forward, but it doesn't happen. You know, as Skye was saying, the mayor goes away and the agency changes.
They've also got to negotiate with other levels of government, right?
But people can continue to create those experiences, to build up that stickiness, to really create a culture around seeing the street in a different way, in a way that is more people first, human scale. And you know, and so I think that's the key. I really think that's the key. I think New York's success and Portland's success in the 70s was because you had a lot of people who were very experienced in organizing a movement, and that really propelled the agency. It gave them a lot of lift. That they were able to continue.
Well, let's talk about New York for a minute. I want to stick to New York because it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that, you know, you talk about Portland in the 70s, it seems to me that New York in recent years has really had, you know, a real burst of urban innovation at the street level.
Yeah.
And I want to know, so what were the ingredients? Like, what did it take? Like,
I think that one of it was to develop a sense of urgency. All of a sudden, Bloomberg said, he created the plan NYC 2030. And he said, we're going to grow by 1 million. If we don't do something, we're going to collapse. Well, New York has 8 million people. The extended Toronto area from Oshawa to Niagara, we have the same 8 million people, except that they're going to grow by 1 million in 40 years. We're going to grow by 4 million in 25 years, so 4 times more and in a much shorter time. And we still have not developed a sense of urgency that we need to do something. I mean, we have done some good things. I think the best thing we have done from the policy point of view is the green belt, to say, hey, municipalities, this is it. You cannot grow beyond this. And from the point of view of project, I think the water from Toronto is fantastic. But we need to develop that sense of urgency. New York, people used to say nothing can happen in New York because of the unions and the politicians and the mafias and what. All of a sudden became this mayor a leader with a group team. Janet Sarikan, Amanda Burden, a few others.
I have to say something though. Before the mayor showed up,
okay, here we go.
Here we go. Before the mayor showed up, there were quite a few advocates because they grew out of the environmental movement, social movements, labor movements, and they came out of the 70s, right? There was an oil crisis, there was a fiscal crisis in urban areas across the United States. And that level of being able to be resilient, organize, overcome, and create a community and create communities of people that wanted to stay in New York, I think really helped New York. And actually, when Bloomberg created Plan YC, which is what Gehl's referring to as sort of as the first sustainability plan that accommodated, that really acknowledged the fact that the city was going to grow, and the city wouldn't be able to grow unless it addressed climate change. A group of advocates sent a letter to Mayor Bloomberg, and if you want a copy of it, it's pretty cool to see. It had 10 recommendations based on what was proposed in Plan YC, and you can see in it that many of the changes that then subsequently were executed by DOT were in this letter. So everything from pedestrianization of Broadway, which is where Times Square is, Flatiron District, Madison Square, the connected bike lanes, even some very, very detailed things like floating parking for the bike lane. Some of these things it's just really incredible to see how if you can get those ideas going outside and alive outside of the political environment, when the political environment then really opens up.
When
I
it's
know
right.
Skye, when Skye was part of that.
I mean, I don't want to minimize that, but the reality is that for 40 years before Bloomberg, all of these same groups had been promoting to make Times Square pedestrian and to make Broadway more pedestrian, whatever, and it had not happened. All of a sudden, you came with a woman, Janet Sari-Khan, that was there. You know, sometimes elected officials or city staff want to be mayors or want to be commissioners. Others want to do as mayor or do as commissioner. So even if it's hard, even if it's not politically nice, even if it's going to, they do it. So the reality is that without a Janet Sari-Khan and without a Bloomberg, it would not have happened. It had not happened in 40 years. We would be waiting for another 40. So I don't want to underestimate the citizen groups, and I think we should support Walk Toronto and Cycle Toronto and People for Transit and all of this. But at the end of the day, we have 2 elections coming up. We have an election at the provincial level. We have an election at the municipal level. We need to get involved in every single ward, because whatever people we elect is what's going to, a lot of the things that are going to happen, and they're going to be choosing a lot of the people. So
you heard it here first.
We need leadership.
I think what's incredible about both of these, both what Gehl and Shin-pei are explaining, is you've got those different stakeholders involved, right? So the advocacy community was ripe. They helped, they had all the backing, they were ready for action. But it was when Jeanette came in and Bloomberg hiring someone willing, like with a backbone, right? Willing to take this on and to get stuff done. And I had her teaching, doing a class to my students yesterday at Columbia. And she was telling the Times Square story and how Bloomberg's asking her, you know, about doing Times Square. And it was when he was in his re-election cycle, right? To be re-elected. And he went around all the top leaders and deputy mayors, should we close Times Square? Should we close Times Square? Everyone said no, right? And then he says to Jeanette, well, you know, I asked my commissioner to tell me the best thing to do, full stop, not the best thing to do based on the election cycle, right? And she said, well, we should close it. And so they closed it for 6 months, right? But the key here was a bit what, like you guys are doing in King Street, is people freak out with change, right? So sometimes in Times Square, the success was closing it for 6 months, collecting a ton of data to show that the businesses did better, people preferred it, vehicles moved more smoothly, bus ridership went up, user preference, it was safer, less people were getting injured, and then they could go back and say, all right, now we make it permanent, because they had a lot of this evidence, right? And that really opened up the door to a citywide approach to rethink the right-of-way as public space. And the city now, I think what's fascinating is they built a demand from the community for this. And if you look at what happened, I don't know if you guys heard about it with de Blasio, the current mayor, when he went to close Times Square or reopen it to cars, right, because of the scantily clad women and the big Elmos that were being dodgy or whatever. And they were like, oh, well, the answer's clearly to open it up and bring back all the cars, right? But the community came back and said, don't you dare. Like, how dare you even propose that? There's no way you can reopen this up, right? So in that period, the advocacy groups, the very bold political action had created the community support and the demand, where, of course, the mayor's not going to do it if all of the community is saying, no, you can't do that, we love this, this is an important part of our city, right? So again, you need all of those pieces working together, which I don't know exactly who's in the audience, but that's where you guys play a fundamental role, is to speak up and say,
let me do an addition, because this is very important what you said of that meeting. I'm a good friend of Janet, and she also explained the meeting. It was her in one end of the table and the mayor the other. Everybody else around were the political advisors, deputy mayors. And every single one advised, especially the political advisors, not to do Times Square, because he might lose the election. It might cost him the election. And he said, Janet, are we ready? Have we done everything that we should have done? Are we ready? She said, yes. So he said, okay, we're doing it. He said, I cannot tell my commissioners to hold on projects based on the fact that if we're going to win or we might not win the next election. I might not be re-elected for the third term. So even when everybody, imagine a mayor, not only of Toronto, but other cities, if they had all of the advisors saying no, this was 10 months before the election when everybody was, so it's about taking that leadership. It's about people that want to do as mayors and not people that want to be mayors, which is a huge difference.
Now, New York also expanded its bike network.
Yes.
Now, and I'm wondering how motorists reacted to that.
I mean, of course, they complained like anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
Right.
They complained, but
Did they
they
organize?
collected data. They put
Okay.
GPSs in all the taxis, and so they could actually say, you know, 3 taxi drivers said, this is the worst design ever, blah, 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 I hate it. But they could show the DOT was really, I mean, Bloomberg's, right? He's a big data guy.
Right.
And so he says you have to be able to manage it, you have to measure it, right? So they would measure the average speeds and look, there's still political court cases going on about some of those. It's never going to be without conflict or without controversy. And again, I think, you know, Jeanette was able to kind of have the backbone to move forward with that. And again, work very closely with the advocacy community and very selectively select where to start, right? Like identify neighborhoods where the communities want it, the businesses want it, and get a showcase project on the ground so that you can then very quickly scale up. And just to note that all the bike lane and plaza projects, all of that stuff that all the controversy is about, less than 1% of the budget of the DOT in that period in Bloomberg. So, you know, the financial argument that politicians often use is not really true. Because we can find the money, right? The money around infrastructure, the bridges and the roads and the potholes, that's important stuff.
Yeah.
But we can certainly find little pieces to get these other pieces that make our cities much more livable.
Okay. I am having a blast up here. I hope it shows. And I want to open it up. Right? If anybody's got a question, please come to a microphone. I'll be checking it. I've still got more, but if anybody wants to come and join in, by all means, step up to the microphone and we'll get you in. Oh, look, we've got someone right here. All right. Please tell us your name and go ahead with the question.
My name's Sarah Kleiman-Haga. It was such an exciting presentation from all 3 of you, so thank you so much. I'm wondering if Gehl could speak to this and both of you as well. In Toronto, we have the King Street pilot. It's, you know, a tremendous success. However, there are people who say it's a ghost town. And it's true at the beginning, and in the winter, it did feel kind of ghost towny. I'm sure it's going to be, it's only because we're used to noise and, you know, horns. It's not because it's actually less. But what are the things we could have done differently with King or with a future pilot to create that animation right away? And I wondered, from your experience in other cities, where has it been not so well done at the beginning, and, you know, what are the keys to just getting everyone out on the streets right away instead of feeling like suddenly we're missing something? What are we seeing more of?
Well, Sarah, first you forgot something very important when you mentioned your name. You forgot to say that you are running for mayor of the city of Toronto.
I'm planning on running for mayor of the city of Toronto. Thanks, Gehl.
Thank you.
Transform Toronto to look like this instead of, you know, the current glacial pace of change towards better streets.
No. Well, you know, first, it's totally doable, all of these changes. These are happening in cities I mean, these are not technical issues. These are not political. I mean, they are political. They are not technical or financial, it's political. So, for example, King Street. I think that they should, one is that when you see the street full of cars, all of a sudden, sometimes it feels that it's full. But it's cars moving through King to go and park on First Canadian Place. So one day I was donating blood, and I came out of donating blood on King, and I said, oh my God, I could walk across the street. And I said, what happened? So the initial perception is that, but then it's people that purchase. It's not cars. Also, it's not cars going by. Also, I think we should have worked also more with the media so that the media would be better prepared. For example, this idiot who came out and gave a finger to the city, he got millions of dollars in free advertisement. All of a sudden, the Toronto Star gave him a front page, 3/4 page, full color photo. You cannot even buy it if you wanted to. You could not go to of his restaurant. Free advertisement. And why this guy? This is one guy. I mean, First Canadian Place I mentioned is 72 floors. Each one of those 72 floors has as much a right to express their opinion as that one restaurant. Why did people keep going? What is the message that media was sending to all the citizens? Do something really obnoxious and grotesque, and we're going to give you all the publicity. So in other words, yes, there are some issues. Times Square. It's been, what, 10 years? Still, 26% of the people in New York are against making Times Square pedestrian. So that's one of the things when I was talking about change. Change is not unanimous. So you need to honestly listen to everybody, but at the end of the day, you need to make a decision. Not making a decision is making a decision. It's saying, okay, we're going to give this to the obnoxious guy. We're going to give him the right.
It's funny, Sarah, actually I was noticing, I was walking there last night when I arrived and again this morning, how quiet it was. And it was lovely. I was thinking, gosh, it's nice to be in an urban area that's actually not like screaming. I have very sensitive ears, right? So I noticed these things. I think it's very normal in a first round of pilot that, you know, people are a little scared, they're not sure what they're doing, and they don't know how it's going to be used. It's also particularly difficult in winter and rainy days, like you noticed. But it can be really key to go and work with the local businesses. It sounds like not the ones who want to pull the fingers, but some of the others that may really be interested in actually utilizing some of that space and putting out some tables and chairs, or looking at working with some local artists to actually repave or paint the surface area is a great one. For capital construction longer term, if it's not a really busy like urban area, not every street has to be bustling and vibrant. Looking at green infrastructure and stormwater management strategies are a great, also, you know, great use of a transformation from asphalt to another purpose. But I mean, I could talk for hours, so I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. But there's many, many things that you could do in terms of activating those spaces and improving access to transit.
A lot of these things are coming up, by the way. I think what they should have done from the beginning to start with them, even if it's in the winter, we need to have great streets in the winter and in the summer and the spring, 52 weeks of the year. So I think a mistake is that they underestimated the need to manage the public space because it was winter and it was planned more for the spring and the summer. But a lot of activation is coming up in the next few weeks.
And I don't know if you guys have the Parklet program here or something similar. I know, you know, you've probably seen it in San Fran and New York. And what's interesting there is the city, if they don't necessarily have the money to implement like an activation of the space or a parking space or maybe like the area near the transit loading, what they can do is they offer to the local business, you know, you can take the space, but you pay for the construction and the removal if it needs to be for snow and so forth. So it's a really great, interesting way to have public and private work together in terms of kind of more nuanced activation as the context of the corridor changes.
I want to ask, as a follow-up, about different uses of streets at different times of day, and whether or not that's something that you see. Right? I imagine you hear a lot about it. The idea that you know, Toronto has lots of street festivals where on a weekend a street will be closed off, and there's nothing more wonderful than walking down the middle of the street that's normally taken up by cars. I lived in Riverdale and just tasted the Danforth. It was just such a joy, right, to finally have that. But can that be done on a like it was one weekend every year? Can you do that on a daily basis or a weekly basis?
Absolutely. I think that the programming, I mean, we often divorce those two kinds of, you know, activation, right? Like there's the self-reinforcing design aspect where you really want design to bring people out, but then there's also the programming and the let's say the software of the street that also has to be thought about. And the more that you can make this a regular habit, the more the city and people will actually gravitate towards coming out.
Let me give an example. Really easy. It's very easy. You open streets to people, you close them to cars, and magic happens. Before immigrating to Canada, I was commissioner in Bogota. And we took a very small program of a few kilometers and a few thousand people, and we turned into the world's largest pop-up park. 121 kilometers. 121 kilometers. Every Sunday of the year and holiday, so 65 days of the year. With the weather that we have in Toronto, we could do it from Victoria Day to Labor Day, every Sunday. We have done with zero government money or tiny bits, and now it has spread all over the place. Paris is doing it 52 weeks of the year. Los Angeles is doing it monthly. New York and many. What is the wonderful, and Toronto would be perfect because it's pretty flat. It's very small. It's only 20 by 40 kilometers. We are a city of neighborhoods. Imagine every morning, every Sunday waking up and say, where am I going to have brunch today? Oh, I'm going to go to Little Italy. Next Sunday, I'm going to go to the beaches. Next one, I'm going to go to Hyde Park and so on. And people come out to
amazing,
walk,
yeah.
to bike, to skate. But more than anything, it's wonderful because we meet each other as equals. It doesn't matter. The owners of the large corporations and their families meet with their minimum wage worker and their families doing the same activity. So this is kind of magical, and there are hundreds of cities around the world doing it, very successful. And actually, New York, they did it. Janet and Amanda Burden, the Commissioner of Planning, came to Bogota on a Friday night, Saturday, talk, 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 Sunday up and down on bicycles. They came back to New York, and they did open streets in New York. Yes.
Very good.
They didn't do it regularly, though. That's
I know.
all.
They don't do it every
Don't spread
week.
that rumor.
The weekly thing is amazing.
want them to do
actually,
more.
because
Yeah, they should do it weekly. They're not doing it weekly, but they
They do
should.
it 3 times a summer.
Yeah, not enough. Clearly
Nothing
not enough.
compared to Bogota.
But what's the innovation and the mental and community habit that has to be developed that isn't there is the notion that you can program street space. We program indoor spaces all the time. We program park space, which is right, but we don't take lanes of roadway and say, well, we're going to program this based on the time of the
And
day
it's
or
amazing
the
what people
period
come
of
up
the year.
with, right? Even without programming,
Right.
once they get used to it. And I think what's incredible about Bogota, now Sao Paulo's doing it on Avenida Paulista, is that when it's weekly, it's not a special event. It becomes part of your routine.
Yeah.
So you go for your Sunday run or your Sunday bike ride or your brunch or whatever it is, but it's part of your routine, and it's unbelievable to see that.
And now we have lineups at the microphones. So I'm going to ask all of us, moderator, questioners, keep your questions brief and our answers brief as well. We want to get input from everybody. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Dory Tunstall, Dean of Design at OCAD University. My question is, in this complete streets, what's the role of animal life in these complete streets? It's very human-centered or human-focused. And I noticed, I was in January in Ahmedabad in India, and it became very stark to see how in Toronto or Melbourne or any of these cities either, like what is completely missing from the city life, right, in terms of the streets, is the role of animals moving through the space as well.
They outlawed cattle drives like in 1910. No, but are you speaking about wildlife or domesticated pets?
Well,
Or
I mean,
both?
sort of from the model of Ahmedabad, right, you have a combination of multiple, right? Like, so
Okay.
you have the dogs and the cows, and you have the monkeys, and you have the chickens, and you have the whatever. But it was a thing where you become really stark to see that in our cities, like Toronto, we don't share a space for animal life, right? Even if you have a pet dog, it's on the leash, please use the curb or whatever, but we don't actually create spaces for animal life.
Well, actually, I think that in Toronto we have many, many, many dog parks, leash-free areas. And I think that dog owners are fantastic because the dog owners, they are outside every day. Whether it's 35 plus 35 degrees or minus 35, they're out there, so they're wonderful users. Actually, I tell you one anecdote, very short. I think that when I go to the dog parks in Sororan Park or I go in Hyde Park or whatever, it's perfect. The fence is the right height, it has benches, it has bags, it has everything. I think we really know what makes dogs happy. But I go to so many playgrounds in Toronto looking for playgrounds that are nice for children under 5, 0 to 5. And I almost see very little or none playgrounds for children under 5. It seems like we know much more what makes dogs happy than what makes children under 5 happy. And we need to be much better also at making parks and play areas. But I think, of course, the dogs are, and cats and whatever are an integral part of the city, and the dog owners are magnificent users.
I think a lot of our work is in developing contexts, and they do tend to have a lot more animals. So we haven't really got designs that are specifically for the donkeys or the cows, but you're right, it's a very present aspect to the vibrancy of the streets that we don't get in a lot of other cities, in North America and Australasia and so forth. But I want to come to your point of the biodiversity, the kind of smaller animals, because I think that's fundamental and it's not often talked about. We didn't really have time to touch on it today, but in terms of like the green infrastructure and the nature in our streets, we've done a rotten job at like destroying our larger regional health and the biodiversity, and I think we've got a really long way to go. And I think streets, because they are continuous networks, not only for people, but they can provide a huge opportunity for us to kind of improve our biodiversity of our cities.
Yeah.
So I think that,
and that's the way that we define public life too, is its strong connection to the environment and the ecosystems, the natural ecosystems. So whatever is indigenous to the region, it's really something to think about and integrate.
Raccoons included. Yes.
Hi, my name is Janet Lowe, and I wanted to pick up on a theme that Sarah Kleiman-Hege had talked about, which is how we set up projects for success right up front. And I think one thing that I found was missing from the presentations is that, yes, placemaking and creating place is really important, but Toronto is a regional city, and our streets, and especially major streets, like even King Street, Bloor Street, Eglinton, are big connectors. And what New York City did really well when they were concurrently creating those public spaces was they created express bus lanes, express buses to improve transit service and their subway system. So their transit network helped shift more people to create alternatives to driving alone in their car, to transit, cycling, and walking. And I think the fatal flaw in my personal opinion of some of our big proposals is that, of course, yes, we had an unfortunate misuse of billions of dollars in terms of not creating a grid, and we need a grid for cycling, a grid for pedestrians, and most importantly, a rapid transit and sort of mix of whether it's ride-hailing, car sharing. We haven't done a robust job of creating those networks, and New York City did, and they did it concurrently. And I think if we want, as advocates and as citizens, to see more of these, we can't forget the mobility network component. And placemaking is absolutely important, but it's that yin-yang and that systems approach, in my opinion.
absolutely. And absolutely. If we're rethinking our streets and we're asking people in car-centric environments, and you're right, we didn't focus on it a lot today, we're another 20 presentations on this, but if we're, on one hand, trying to make it harder for people to drive, we have to invest in making it easier for them to have safer and convenient and affordable alternatives. And so that absolutely does mean transit, it does mean cycling, and it means walking, and it means looking at all of those three together. And so the mass transit, giving dedicated space for transit is fundamental, because you are never going to get somebody out of their car to take the bus or to take the streetcar or to take whatever mass transit mode you have in your city if that vehicle is stuck in the same traffic as the cars, right? So only when maybe your commute shifts to, say, 20 minutes instead of an hour sitting in a car, do you start to switch your mentality and say, oh, well, actually, like that extra 40 minutes in the morning and 40 minutes in the afternoon, I could go to the gym, I could be with my kids, we have a different value in our time. So absolutely, it's another huge topic that cannot be overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely, you have to make that investment. But I think that also maybe it's good to kind of position New York City in its appropriate place here, where the subway system was built a long, long time ago. And the dedicated lanes for buses were here and there and were quite problematic in terms of enforcement. And frankly, bus ridership has declined in the years since we added all this innovation to New York City. So you have to look at things on balance. Skye is absolutely right. You have to make that investment. And I actually think buses are a completely overlooked asset in cities. Often the network is not updated to reflect new land use patterns. The technology in North America, the technology that is available to make bus riding a luxurious feeling experience is just not applied. People go first for the shiny object of light rail or something versus buses, which feel very pedestrian, I guess. I think there's an opportunity there actually to really invest in bus networks to make space for that balance you're talking about.
Transit signals,
yeah, exactly.
Lanes. There's a lot of strategies.
There's a lot of strategies at the street surface level.
They're noticing a lot of the bus lanes in New York. A lot of it, I think, at least a third of the time, the bus was static.
Yeah.
Right? So it's also looking at the systems that you've got and identifying opportunities to improve efficiency within the infrastructure that we already have.
Many people are asking for infrastructure for public transit. If we look at the city, again from the air, 35% of the city are already streets. So do we want that to be 45, 55, 60? How much? It's just how do we want to use? Do we want to have a two-body bus with 120 people? Or do we want to have 120 cars with one person? Because we can do one or the other. But if the bus is going to go behind cars, the 120 people behind cars with one person, then people are going to say, if I'm going to go as fast, I might as well take the car. So the public transit has to be faster and cheaper and more convenient, or people are not going to switch.
Prioritized.
So I think part of the challenge as a regional city is that we need a way to ramp up quickly enough to create rapid, whether it's jitneys or buses, to make it actually competitive with being a single driver in a single vehicle, especially if autonomous vehicles and automated vehicles are becoming more attractive as well.
Now, Skye, your presentation made mention of autonomous vehicles and Ubers and so forth, but one of the base elements of the business case for autonomous vehicles is that you'll need fewer of them on the road. Do you not buy that? Because that is, for people who don't know, the idea being that if all the cars are driving themselves, they'll be too expensive to own, but you won't need to own one anyway, because they'll always be, they'll pick you up, they'll drop you off, and then they'll pick up someone else there and drive them elsewhere, and people will ride share, and you'll need only as many, the number of vehicles required for the same number of trips will decline drastically.
So you may, certainly things like parking, you may find new opportunities with AV, right? Because the storage of the vehicle when it's not moving is a huge kind of untapped asset in our cities. Look at places like Texas and, you know, parts of California and many other, I think around here, right, as well.
Oh, underground parking in condominiums is great. Skateboarding ramps.
Imagine what we could do with that space with the parking, but I think the other aspect is the kind of vehicle miles traveled, right? And so it's not necessarily less, like the Ubers and Lyfts and so forth are showing an increase in vehicle miles traveled. Right, because people are taking that instead of taking the transit and instead of walking and instead of biking, and actually that's very problematic in a lot of the big cities. So the kind of happy, shiny image that we want, or we've been told, or what we are still being told, that ride sharing is going to solve all of our problems, actually our streets are becoming more congested. Because there's more trips in
what you ask is critical for the cities. 2 seconds. Because the autonomous cars, when you see a traffic jam, what makes the congestion is not the driver, it's the car. So whether those cars have a driver or not, you're going to have the same congestion. So you might need less parked cars because people are going to be using shared cars. But you might have many more cars on the road. When you are 70, 75, you're not going to lose your driver's license. You don't need a driver's license. So you might be using cars till the day you die.
And they might be slightly smaller.
You might be 5 years old and you're going to have a car. It depends. Are we going to allow people-less cars? You come here, you don't find parking, you tell the car to go home and come back in 2 hours. So the possibility is that we can have many more cars moving, less cars parked. So there might be more congestion, more sprawl, because people say, if I'm not going to drive, I don't care living 10 minutes further away, I'm going to be taking a nap. So it's very important how do we, that's again the case of technology. Are we going to use technology for people, or are we going to force people to adjust to technology?
And if we can take the AV discussion to mass transit and microtransit and away from the individual car, then I think we would be getting to some very exciting places.
Okay, very good. I was just going to say, when I was 8 years old, the idea of having a car drive me around was my idea of a great city. Sir, please.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm from Brampton. It takes me about 2 hours to come here. And I noticed the difference between the two places. But today I want to just mention that older people need walkways. They like to walk, and they need to have walkways like escalators, like they have in Detroit Airport, mile after mile after mile. So people can enjoy the waterfront being on the walkway, and mobile. And they can sit if they want to because there are benches provided on it. They can put their bag there, and this is one idea. And then there are benches in York region. I used to live there. And there are benches at the terminal, bus terminal, low line, sloping, and made of steel. They are cold. People can't sit on it. They slip. You put the bag will slip down. And it has been going on for 10 years. But a wonderful thing that York region has done, they always announce, please keep seated till the bus comes to a full stop. And that saves a lot of injury and anguish. Brampton is only experimenting on this example. They haven't done it. So there are more to say. And one more point.
Yeah.
Toronto is not flat. There is another city of Toronto full of valleys. There are whole slew of valleys where you can go for walking, enjoying, and try this watershed, that watershed, and compare it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's a great point just to note the details of design really do matter in the urban environment, and you know, getting the angle of a park bench or, you know, the material to sit on and those details, you know. The first step is making sure the bench is there and then getting those details right. So thank you for bringing that up.
We're down to our last 10 minutes. We don't have to end yet, but we are down to our last 10 minutes. So I'm going to stand as a sign of a sense of urgency that we have a number of people who would like to ask questions, and I want to make sure we get to as many as we possibly can before we run out of time in our shootout.
Do you want to take a couple?
Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Tori. I have a very quick question. Skye and Shin, you both talked about people data and trying to create sort of this universal language so we can all learn from this data. And it feels to me like we're all here because we do want change, and I'm sure many of us are here because we believe in the idea of complete streets. Is there a way that you would suggest we can access this amazing data so that we can create innovations of our own that will help us design better, more complete streets?
Go to our website. Our protocol is available to download, and all the tools that you need to collect the data are also open source and on our site with templates and how-tos and all of that. So absolutely.
And is that what you would be the best access point for people to use?
I think so. And then I would tap I think there's been some of that data collection in Toronto actually, and I think data collected from the public realm is public data. So get that from your agency.
There is an open,
I think
there's an open
make a
data
suggestion,
portal
right?
for the City of Toronto
Yeah.
online.
I think, with all respect to both of my colleagues, don't pay so much attention to the data sometimes. I think it's more important the heart than the brain. People keep working on the data. There was 2 years of data for North York and Yonge Street. And all of a sudden, the mayor and a couple of councillors did a design on the back of a napkin, and that is the proposal against 2 years of data.
Data can help encourage investment, and when you are equipped with the right kind of data to help people understand patterns and how behaviors are shaping our city, how people are walking and using the combination of walking and using transit, and how are they getting their things around if they don't have the trunk of a car, how are they getting their things around if they don't have a pannier for their bike. So behaviors will help, understanding behaviors help us to probably encourage investment in certain areas, or for our own innovations that we're trying to create.
Yeah, I think both are critical, right? You've got to get the heart and the numbers as
I
well,
agree.
and then you look at your audience,
Right.
right? Different people care about different things, so you want to know who you're talking to, who you're pitching to.
Right.
Similar to Shin-pei, we're happy to share any of the templates and so forth. There's also a bunch of case studies in here where we've tried to pick street transformation before and afters where people have collected data. And so there's at least 20. It's very hard to find globally because a lot of people don't do it. But hopefully with Gehl's new protocol and different cities collecting more data, we'll have more and more case studies where you can bring that as rebuttal to say, look, no, if you put in a bike lane, the businesses don't go out of business. And if you take away some parking, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Look, here are 3 projects that have done this. Let's try it. So yeah, we can.
Hold up the book for everyone to see.
Sure. So it's free download as well on the NACTO Global Designing Cities Initiative. Yeah.
And it's
when I
so
say
much,
hard,
it's
it's not fluffy.
book.
What I'm talking about hard is find out what matters to each decision maker. Because when you talk about complete streets, maybe to one councillor, what matters is mental health because has a family member with mental issues. But the other councillor doesn't care about health, cares about the environment, so talk about the level of noise. The other councillor is about economic development. So find out what each decision maker cares about. So that's when I say go to the heart is the emotional part. Once they are convinced of it, then they'll get the data. So the data is very, very important, but I think sometimes you gotta get them on board through an emotional, something that will hit them in the heart.
And work with journalists. Go and ask some journalists, I'll just say, because I think often media jump on the standard story. So
I've got to keep this moving.
Sir. Hi, thanks. I'll be very quick. Brad Bradford's my name. Today, Gehl, you alluded to it, contentious sort of discussion at council. A lot of people were interested in a more complete street vision for Yonge Street. But one of the points of opposition that kind of came up today was, until we have the transit further north and give people other options to the car, some politicians or councillors felt uncomfortable moving forward with a position where there's not other alternatives already in place. So I guess my question is, how do we bridge and make the investments that we need to make now that we know to encourage people to shift mode while at the same time understanding the political implications of if there isn't great transit options at that point or not everyone's going to ride a bike, it becomes politically challenging for those elected officials to move forward with it. Thanks.
I would say it's by moving away from the issue of bicycles and cars. Yonge is 150,000 new people are in the area. So how are those children moving? It's talk about happiness, talk about anxiety, depression, talk about people walking around the businesses, talk about the level of the noise, the quality of the air. So shift the discussion and notice how many cars or how many bicycles, but about all the other issues.
Our next question.
Okay, I was really struck by Skye's reference to streets as rooms. I think that's really an interesting way of thinking about our city because we think too much of streets as sluices. They might be auto sluices, they might be transit sluices, they might be pedestrian sluices. And so this is a bit of a bit tangential, but in Toronto...
You have people behind you, so...
So no, I'm trying to get... Anyway,
Good.
So in Toronto, the building guidelines for new construction, which is where new streets are being, kind of transformed, often require double height, sort of pedestrian realm, first floor space, which in my opinion, has turned out to be very sterile. It's a sterilizing influence along cities. And I'm just wondering if there's anyone who has been doing work on alternative ways of thinking about bases of big buildings that actually create smaller space that's more affordable, space that supports diversity.
Yeah, sure. We can chat after, and I can also give you a reference card. But in my old hat, when I worked for the City Planning Department in New York, we did a whole publication called Shaping the Sidewalk Experience. The whole thing was breaking down the very specific policies that cities around, it was a North American study, used to shape all the different aspects of the street, from the ground plane to the edges, and things like what Shin-pei was looking at, the pace and the breakdown of the storefront, spacing between entrances, levels of transparency, signage, details, that kind of stuff. That's all really important, right, to get in the hands of the policymakers, but also the architects and designers that are designing those projects. And that's where the details totally matter. So I can give you some of those references after too.
Anyone want to add? Or we'll go to our next question.
Hello, I'm a Levon student from University of Toronto. Thank you for sharing your experience. I'm interested in the phenomenon of inequality in general, and I was curious to ask you, all these brilliant examples So let's say in Toronto, there's a third population again in the great area, which is low-income population. In New York is extremely diverse city, and we can't just focus on the beautiful and shiny Times Square or Green Line or waterfront in Toronto, which are brilliant and powerful examples. But what is it what makes us to start from these wealthy parts of the city, parts of the city which are already privileged, instead of empowering people who are underprivileged, right? And starting from the maximizing the. And then the second brief question would be, why is this, again, the events like this could be empowering us on this side, since this is a public talk in a sense, or what are alternatives for events like this, again, where we are sharing our experience and people who are experts are again learning from people who are walking on the streets.
Yep.
Well. Thank you.
Well, I know a common question I've been hearing from a few different audience members is, where do you start? How do you start the project? How do you choose that point where you can have a successful demonstration? And we show Times Square because we happen to have a lot of data about it. But actually, that pedestrianization, the plaza projects, they started in neighborhoods that were not shiny or exciting or anything like that. And I would encourage people to think about, those opportunities. The other aspect of a lot of the change that was accomplished in New York was to work with communities outside of the central business district to do those demonstrations and to actually provide the framing. We've heard a lot of different framings, like there's health, there's economic development, there's equity, social justice, environment, right? And to work with those to find those alliances. So half of the time when I was working on advocacy, we were working through a public health lens for equity reasons, for social inclusion reasons, not because we were trying to get a bike lane. But the bike lane was part of the solution to achieve this. And then the final point is that sometimes you have a system that you're trying to introduce, and it's really important to demonstrate that it works in a popular place. And I think that was the strategy that New York took on bike share. It doesn't work everywhere, but you have to balance these different opportunities.
I think the issue of equity must be top priority everywhere, including Toronto. 1 out of 5 children live in poverty here. We got over 180,000 people on the wait list for housing. We have huge problems of equity. The issue that I mentioned of the tree canopy, 85% in the wealthy neighborhoods, 6 to 10% in the low income. And people say, oh, but why invest in the streets, in the sidewalks, in the parks in low income areas if they have so many more needs? Actually, when the poor people really feel miserable, it's in the leisure time. So the CEO of the bank or the minimum wage worker cleaning floors have similar experience when they're working. But in the leisure time, the CEO of the bank has restaurants and theaters and movies and cottages and clubs and so on. The minimum wage worker doesn't. So if we improve the public space, the sidewalk, the corner, the park, everything, we're really improving quality of life. So that has to become an absolutely top priority for Toronto. And I think that's why I included. Complete street is not just about walking, biking, transit, and cars. It's also about having streets that integrate, that are not segregated. That is not some streets for the rich, some streets for the poor. You go to the wealthy neighborhoods in Toronto, almost every street is 30K an hour. Almost everyone, go to the annex. All of the streets have bumps, have stop signs, are not through, are the traffic calm, and so on. Go to Thorncliffe and Flemington, none of them. So we have that issue of equity, and we need to solve it without gentrifying.
Skye, do you want to add anything to
just
that?
super quickly, I can add there's some bike share and equity references and resources on the NACTO website, so feel free to take a look. To Shin-pei's mention about the Times Square, the plaza, but being out in the communities, I would also look that up on the NYC DOT because it's an application-based process, so communities can apply to have these transformations in their own communities, and they, as long as they get a few stakeholders together and kind of get a maintenance plan, and there's people who help put that package together. But in terms of making sure that we have equitable distribution of public space, that can also be mapped against access to parks and plazas. that exist already, right? To prioritize intervention of plazas in neighborhoods that have the highest need. So there's a lot of great resources out there.
Thank you.
There are 2 questioners left. It is 9:01, but no one has turned off the microphones yet, so quick, let's squeeze them in. Sir.
Hi, good evening. First of all, thank you. My name is Charlie, and as one of Toronto's many pedestrians and public transportation users, I would like to highlight on a major issue in hopes that you and maybe our future mayor have solutions for it. And that is the bus or streetcar stops, where many of them are unshielded and leave us all unprotected in extreme weather conditions, where we have to wait for the next bus or streetcar. And even the ones that are equipped with such facilities, they are not very well equipped to protect from the wind. And the one next to my apartment is unprotected at all, and many times I resulted in taking an Uber or a taxi because I could not wait under such conditions. So I would like to know your approach or your vision on such a problem and helping the importance of the pedestrian in the cities. Thank you.
It's really simple. It's a priority. Either we make it a priority or we don't. The highest pedestrian street corner in Canada, not in Toronto, in Canada, is Yonge and Dundas. And in the northeast corner, there is not even a shelter. At the highest pedestrian street corner, it's totally unacceptable that we do that. So people are not going to get out of their cars if they cannot even have a shelter for the rain, for the snow, for the wind, in the summer for the heat. So either we make it cheaper, faster, more comfortable, or people are not going to switch. And actually, it's an insult to people to have those kind of conditions that should be the bare minimum.
Yes, thank you. I am insulted now.
Thank you for the question. Our last question.
Yeah, thank you for spending the evening with us. My name is Kaleem Klein. I'm a designer, educator, and Torontonian. And I'd like to ask each of you, what is the one actionable item that Toronto should take in the next year to move from a good to a great city?
That's a perfect question. It's the one I was gonna ask. So there it is.
You can go first, Gehl, since you're from here.
Yeah, go ahead. Don't want to lecture you about your city.
No, just 2 things. When we evaluate if our streets are good or not, let's see is how many of us would like to sleep at home but live outside. That it would be a symptom of great streets. And the one action would be for the city of Toronto, as well as Brampton and every other city, to say, given the fact that it is good for the environment, for public health, for economic development, for everything, pedestrians first. Let's have a law of 2 words, pedestrians first, so that everything that we do in our city, everything, when you're going to do a development, the first thing that you got to take to the planning department is how are you going to treat the pedestrians? Everyone, from small children to older adults.
And then enact that look at the street map. I would take the map of all of the grids in Toronto and literally draw what you would do to change that. Is it bus stops? Is it the shorter crossings? Is it getting rid of cars? Is it, come up with a plan for the streets themselves and then pick like the first top 5 and go and like implement it tomorrow. In pilot projects, do it quickly and collect some data around it.
Building on that, I say be bold, but be nimble and don't chase the shiny and new. Chase things that are proven and true. And I think particularly you don't have the rail system, but you have a lot of street space. So you can really invest in bus transit specifically, and bike and pedestrian infrastructure a lot more easily than other places.
Put a value on every square meter of your street space.
And the sense of urgency. We're going to have 50% more population in 25 years. So we don't have too much time to think. We cannot even blink. We blink and there's a new neighborhood all over the extended GTA. So we really need to act. When people say, oh, bro, this is only 4 years, it doesn't matter. Well, 4 years when we're growing that fast is a lot of time. So make sure that everyone will work in some campaign, whoever you think, but 2 very strategic decisions on what's going to happen in the future of Ontario and the future of Toronto.
And maybe vote for this lady. I don't know her, but she sounds pretty...
Well, listen, and that's all the time we have for today. Can I please ask for a round of applause for our panelists? Skye, Gehl, and Shin-pei, thank you so much. You're welcome. A quick announcement before you leave. If you enjoyed this, especially if you enjoyed this, we already have our next, or I should say Sidewalk Toronto has its next public talk lined up. Mark your calendars. The date is April the 24th. Same time, same place right here. The topic will be affordable housing. And your host will be Jane Farrow. The guests and panelists will be announced next week. Watch sidewalktoronto.ca for all the details. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you again.